Hi, I'm Carter Wilson, bestselling author and writing coach, and welcome to this Motivations for Writers. Today I want to talk about manifestation. So we hear that a lot these days. Manifest what you want. And for us writers, especially us long-form writers, what we want is a written novel. We want to complete our work. So I want to talk about manifesting your novel. But I want to talk about it honestly, not in the way that you might be used to seeing it discussed online, not as wishful thinking or blind positivity, and certainly not as something that replaces effort. Because manifestation, when it actually works, isn't anything mystical. It's psychological. It's behavioral. It's about how you hold belief steady enough and long enough to act. Because this is what most writers eventually run into, is that writing isn't hard because the work is complex. It's hard because doubt shows up before evidence does. And manifestation is how you decide who you are in that gap. So let's start by clearing something up. Manifestation does not mean the book just appears fully formed on the page. It doesn't mean you don't ever feel lost. It doesn't mean you stop questioning yourself. I've written over a dozen novels, and every time I sit down to write, and many times throughout the process of writing, I am full of doubt. I am sure the story isn't working. Manifestation does not remove uncertainty. What it removes, ultimately, is hesitation. It's the decision to move forward before certainty arrives. In all that self-doubt, it means you keep writing. You don't go back and revise because you have to have something perfect. It means you carry forward into that doubt, through that unknown. Most writers believe they will feel ready first and then they'll write. But I can tell you that is backwards. Readiness comes from action. Clarity comes from motion. And confidence comes from follow-through. Manifestation is how you stop waiting for permission you're never going to get anyway. I think about all the writers who I've met, all the aspiring writers who tell me they're working on a novel or that they have an idea. And from my observation, 90% of them never finish that book. And they don't fail because they lack ideas. They fail because they freeze. They freeze at the beginning when the blank page feels like an overwhelming test. Or they feel that they're going to freeze in the middle when the story just refuses to go the direction that they thought. Or they even get towards the end and then they freeze because finishing means committing to something imperfect. That freezing sometimes feels responsible. It feels thoughtful. It feels like care in a way. But most of the time, freezing is just fear disguised as some kind of discernment. And manifestation is the ability to notice that moment and choose movement instead. And if you want manifestation to work, you have to start with identity, not outcome. You can't manifest a novel while secretly seeing yourself as someone who might write one someday. You have to see yourself as the person who writes, even when that writing is uncomfortable, messy, or unclear. You have to see writing as your job, even if it's not paying you a dime. You have to assume the identity of a writer, even if by doing so, you feel like a fraud. And this isn't about pretending, and it's not about lying to yourself. It's about deciding who you are based on behavioral and not results. And here's just a very small practical shift you can make. Instead of saying, I'm trying to write a novel, you say, I am writing a novel. And maybe you haven't touched it for months. You say these words, even if it feels untrue, even if the draft is terrible, even if the process is taking years. Your brain responds to what you repeatedly do, not what you hope will happen. So every time you sit down and write, despite all that doubt, you're going to reinforce that identity. Manifestation requires one uncomfortable skill, which is believing without proof. At the beginning of a novel, there is no evidence, there's no momentum, no clarity, no reassurance. And no one is going to do it for you. You're asking yourself to act before the reward appears. That's why manifestation feels hard. But belief, in this context, doesn't mean optimism, it means assumption. You assume the work matters. You assume the process will teach you. And you assume finishing is worth doing, even or especially if the outcome is unknown. That assumption changes how you behave. I had 3 full books written before I ever sold my 4th. I lived in a world of constant rejection. But I kept writing, not only because I love storytelling, but because it was just who I had become. I was a writer. Without $1 of earnings, I was a writer. That's how I always viewed myself from that very first novel. It wasn't something I was experimenting with. I had no idea how the publishing industry worked. I just knew from that first book that I would identify as a writer for the rest of my life. And that's the kind of assumption that changes how you behave. Because if you assume you're a writer, you're going to show up every day and write. And it doesn't matter how imperfect that writing is. What matters is you are assuming the identity of who you've been the whole time. So let's talk a little bit about visualization, because visualization is often misunderstood. When we talk about manifestation, writers think that means visualizing success, praise, publication, validation. But that does nothing when you're sitting there alone with your draft. So instead, visualize process. Visualize yourself sitting down on a difficult day, writing when the scene feels flat, or continuing when you just want to stop and question everything. See yourself writing despite all the obstacles, because that's the behavior that creates books. You're not training yourself to feel good. You're training yourself to stay present. And of course, doubt is going to show up because, you know what? For writers, it always does. But doubt doesn't mean you're failing, and it doesn't mean your idea is wrong, and it doesn't mean you should stop. Doubt is simply the cost of doing meaningful work. The mistake is believing doubt deserves control. So here's a useful practice. When doubt appears, name it, acknowledge it, and then return to the work. Don't argue with it. Don't try to silence it. Don't negotiate with it. Manifestation is continuing despite doubt, not eliminating it. And momentum is the real manifestation tool. Momentum quiets that doubt. It builds clarity. It makes the work feel inevitable. You build momentum by continuing when you usually stop. By asking one simple question, what comes next? Because that question assumes the story continues. That assumption is manifestation in action. Manifestation gives you courage, not shortcuts. It teaches you to act before proof arrives, to trust momentum, to stay present when doubt appears. You don't need confidence, you need follow-through. You don't need certainty, you need willingness. So write that draft. Finish it. And let the next version of you just take it from there. I can tell you from 20 plus years of experience, that is how novels are manifested. Now go write.